Picture this. You are a Hungarian knight in the spring of 1241, encased in 80 pounds of riveted steel and heavy chainmail. You are sitting atop a massive war horse on the plains near the banks of the Sajo River, waiting for the honorable clash of heavy cavalry. You expect a civilized war. You expect blaring trumpets, colorful banners, and a chaotic but predictable melee where the thickest armor always wins. Instead, the sky above you turns entirely black. A continuous, deafening hiss fills the air. Before you can even lower your iron lance, the men beside you are choking on their own blood, their throats pierced by bone-tipped arrows fired from half a mile away. You spur your exhausted horse forward to engage the enemy in close combat, but there is no enemy to hit. The foreign riders in the distance simply turn their nimble ponies, shoot backward over their shoulders with terrifying precision, and vanish into the smoke. You are not fighting a traditional army. You are being hunted by ghosts. In a matter of hours, the absolute pride of European chivalry is reduced to a panicked, bleeding mob trapped in a burning camp and systematically slaughtered like livestock. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The nightmare you just witnessed is the Battle of Mohi. It is not merely a tactical defeat for the Kingdom of Hungary. It is the sudden, violent shattering of the entire European reality. For centuries, the lords of the West believed their iron-clad knights and towering stone castles made them the apex predators of the medieval world. They spent their days fighting petty squabbles over tiny strips of muddy land, utterly convinced that their slow, thundering cavalry charges were the ultimate expression of military supremacy. They were tragically, fatally wrong. While the kings of Europe were playing a localized, arrogant game of chess, an apocalyptic war machine had already swallowed the rest of the planet. The Mongol Empire had erased the greatest ancient dynasties of Asia, annihilated the sprawling, wealthy cities of the Middle East, and burned the Grand Principality of Kiev to ash. Now the hardened riders of the Eastern Steppe have crossed the Carpathian Mountains. They have not come to negotiate treaties. They have not come to conquer a few border towns or demand a meager tribute. They have come to consume the world. King Bela IV of Hungary managed to scrape together an army of roughly 80,000 men, an absolute titan of a force by European standards. He rode out believing he was going to teach a harsh lesson to a disorganized mob of pagan barbarians. He did not realize that his rigid, slow-moving army was walking blindly into a mechanical meat grinder engineered by the most ruthlessly efficient military intelligence network the Earth had ever seen. The Mongols did not fight for glory, honor, or the favor of a god. They fought for absolute extermination. They brought early gunpowder bombs, calculating tacticians, and a recurve composite bow that could punch through European ringmail like wet paper. As the Hungarian army disintegrates into the freezing mud of the Sajo River, leaving 50,000 rotting corpses in their wake, a terrifying realization sweeps across the continent. There is no backup plan. The Holy Roman Empire is heavily fractured. The Pope is embroiled in bitter political feuds. The fundamental military doctrine that Europe relied upon for its survival has just been rendered completely obsolete in a single, bloody afternoon. The Mongol vanguard is now standing at the bleeding edge of the West, washing their horses in the Danube. If Hungary falls, there is no natural geographic barrier, no grand allied army, and no savior left to stop them from riding their horses straight into the Cathedral of Notre Dame or the ancient ruins of the Colosseum. The year is 1241, and Western civilization is blindly staring into the abyss of its own extinction. Let us strip away the most dangerous lie ever told in Western history books. The word is barbarian. For centuries, European chroniclers desperately tried to cope with their own slaughter by painting the Mongols as a mindless, screaming horde of unwashed savages who simply overwhelmed the noble knights with sheer, uncountable numbers. It is a comforting fiction. It is entirely false. If you want to understand why the ground of Eastern Europe is packed so densely with aristocratic bones, you have to look at the terrifying contrast between the two war machines on a fundamental psychological level. In the year 1241, European warfare is essentially an extreme, heavily armed country club. Kings and dukes view battle as an arena for personal glory and financial gain. You do not annihilate your enemy. You knock him off his horse, hold him for an exorbitant ransom, and drink wine while your conscripted peasants bleed out in the mud. There is no central command. There is no strategic cohesion. A European army is a bloated, slow-moving circus of massive egos clad in iron, dragging along an endless train of baggage, wives, camp followers, and squires. They communicate by shouting across a loud battlefield and hoping someone important hears them. Now pivot your gaze to the east. The army crossing the frozen rivers into Europe is not a horde. It is a highly specialized, ruthlessly meritocratic corporation of death. They are led by Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, but the true architect of the apocalypse is an aging, overweight, one-eyed general named Subutai. Subutai is so old and heavy by this point that he can no longer sit on a horse. He is pulled across the burning steppes in an iron-bound carriage. But inside that carriage sits a mind that understands the brutal mathematics of warfare better than anyone alive. Before a single Mongol archer ever notched an arrow, Subutai spent years weaving an invisible web of espionage across the continent. He sent spies disguised as merchants, diplomats, and fleeing refugees deep into the heart of the West. While King Bela IV of Hungary was busy arguing with his own barons over petty land disputes, Subutai already had detailed maps of the Hungarian road systems, the grazing pastures, and the political fractures of the Holy Roman Empire. The Mongols knew exactly who hated whom in Europe. They knew the Pope was currently trying to excommunicate the Emperor. They weaponized European ignorance long before they weaponized their bows. When the invasion finally launches, it is a masterclass in Subutai tactics. The Mongols do not march as one massive, slow target. They split into multiple, highly mobile columns, operating completely independently across hundreds of miles of brutal terrain, separated by mountain ranges and hostile territory. Yet they are tethered together by a flawless system of swift couriers, smoke signals, and black flags. Subutai orchestrates a continental pincer movement with the precision of a modern synchronized watch. 3 separate Mongol armies march through Poland, Transylvania, and Hungary, annihilating regional forces before they can ever merge, and then perfectly converge on the plains of Mohi on the exact day Subutai planned. The European mind simply cannot comprehend this level of operational coordination. A knight expects to face a man with a sword, standing directly in front of him. He is entirely unprepared to face an algorithm. The Mongols fight in complete silence, directed by the mute waving of colored flags. They utilize feigned retreats, pretending to break in terror, running away for days on end, completely exhausting the heavily armored European horses pursuing them. Then, at a pre-calculated choke point, the trap snaps shut. The running men suddenly turn, form an impenetrable crescent, and unleash a mechanical storm of armor-piercing arrows. They do not care about honor. They do not take noble hostages. They are not fighting to conquer a castle. They are fighting to erase a civilization from the map. And as the trap closes, the arrogant knights of the West finally realize they are not the main characters of history. They are just the next harvest. April 1241. The Royal Hungarian army is camped on the western bank of the Sajo River. King Bela IV looks at the rushing water and smiles with arrogant satisfaction. Spring runoff has made the river high, violent, and freezing cold. There is only one stone bridge crossing this deadly expanse of water, and the king has stationed his most elite, heavily armored cavalry to guard it. In the mind of a medieval European monarch, warfare is basic geometry. The enemy is on that side, we are on this side, the bridge is the only door, and we hold the key. They feel absolutely, untouchably safe. They build a massive camp, chaining their heavy baggage wagons together to form a fortified circle. They think they are building an impenetrable fortress. In reality, they have just nailed their own coffin shut. Across the river, Subutai is not playing European geometry. The aging, one-eyed general is playing a multi-dimensional game of chess with bleeding pieces. He understands this terrain better than the Hungarians who live on it. While King Bela's men drift into a deep sleep, blindly trusting the river to protect them, the Mongol war machine begins to operate in the dead of night. Subutai never attacks where the enemy is strongest. Instead, under the cover of darkness, he sends a detachment led by Batu Khan straight at the main bridge. Swords clash, screams tear through the night air, and the Hungarian knights desperately rush to defend the crossing. In the chaotic dark, using heavy crossbows, the Europeans actually manage to repel the first Mongol charges. Cheers erupt in the Christian ranks. They think they are beating the unbeatable army. They took the bait. They have absolutely no idea that a few miles downstream, an unprecedented engineering miracle is silently taking place. While every European eye is fixated on the bridge, Subutai has ordered his engineers to do what the West considers impossible. In pitch blackness, standing in freezing, rushing water, the Mongols are lashing wooden rafts together, constructing a massive pontoon bridge across the treacherous river. There is no shouting. There are no torches. There is only the terrifying, cold efficiency of a military machine executing its programming. As the first light of dawn breaks, Subutai's perfect trap snaps shut. 70,000 Mongols do not attack from the front. They rise up like ghosts from the riverbanks on the Hungarian flank. Simultaneously, to completely break the resistance at the main bridge, the sky suddenly roars. 7 massive Mongol catapults open fire, but they are not throwing standard rocks. For the first time in European history, ironclad knights are introduced to the sheer terror of early gunpowder and smoke grenades. Bombs packed with sulfur, pitch, and crude explosives detonate in the middle of the Hungarian defensive line. The deafening blasts cause the massive European warhorses to panic, rearing up and trampling their own masters into the mud. Thick, noxious smoke blinds the defenders, turning the battlefield into a sensory nightmare. The absolute pride of Western chivalry shatters in an instant against the overwhelming firepower of the East. The Hungarians break. They turn and sprint back to their chained wagon fort, completely unaware that Subutai has herded them exactly where he wants them. Inside King Bela's circular wagon fort, the situation has ceased to be a battle. It is a blazing slaughterhouse. Thousands of bone-tipped arrows blot out the sun, raining down in a continuous deadly arc. The heavily armored knights, the undisputed apex predators of Europe, are now trampling over each other in a slippery soup of mud, blood, and horse entrails just to find a miserable place to hide. Their romantic desire to fight for honor and glory is entirely broken, replaced by the most pathetic, primal instinct to simply survive. And just as the panic and the screaming reach an absolute crescendo, something strange happens. The dense, suffocating wall of Mongol cavalry to the west suddenly thins out. A gap opens up, a clear, arrow-free path leading straight out of the apocalyptic meat grinder, pointing directly toward the capital city of Pest. The exhausted Hungarians see the exit. They think the enemy line has broken. They think God has finally answered their desperate, bleeding prayers. They are wrong. God did not open that door, Subutai did. In the ruthless art of war, there is a psychological concept known as the Golden Bridge. General Subutai knows that a cornered animal with no escape will fight with the absolute frenzy of the dying, and that would cause unnecessary casualties for his own men. But if you give that cornered animal a tiny sliver of hope, an illusion of an escape route, they will immediately drop their weapons, turn their backs, and run. Subutai did not march thousands of miles to fight desperate men in hand-to-hand combat. He wants to hunt cowards. The moment the Hungarian ranks break and flood out of that intentional gap, the real trap finally closes. The armored knights throw away their cumbersome shields. They frantically unbuckle their heavy iron breastplates just so they can run faster. They whip their exhausted, foaming horses to the breaking point. But you cannot outrun the ghosts of the steppe. The Mongols do not give chase to engage in melee. They casually ride their smaller, infinitely more resilient ponies parallel to the fleeing mob. They flank the running men, draw their composite recurve bows, and methodically shoot the Europeans in the back from a completely safe distance. Arrows punch through thin tunics and sink deep into spines and skulls. Screams for mercy echo across the plains, answered only by the mechanical hiss of the next arrow. This is not military combat. This is an industrial-scale hunting operation spanning 3 days and dragging across 50 miles of blood-soaked earth. The road from the Sajo River back to Pest becomes a carpet of pulverized meat. The corpses of powerful dukes, high bishops, and tens of thousands of conscripted peasants are left to rot in the sun, piled so high they block the dirt roads. The mighty Kingdom of Hungary, the ultimate eastern shield of Europe, is erased in a single blink of history. The Mongols did not just defeat an army, they exterminated a quarter of a nation's entire population. As the news of this massacre, along with the simultaneous destruction of Poland at Liegnitz, spreads westward, a suffocating terror grips the continent. Europe realizes these invaders do not want ransoms, they do not want treaties, they want to leave behind a kingdom of bones. In the medieval world, winter is the great universal ceasefire. When the heavy snow begins to fall, European armies simply go home. Knights sit by roaring hearths, peasants huddle in thatched huts, and kings drink spiced wine while waiting for the spring thaw. War in December is considered a logistical impossibility by Western standards. Men freeze, horses starve in the barren fields, and the freezing mud swallows heavy supply wagons whole. So, as the brutal winter of 1241 descends upon the smouldering, blood-soaked ruins of Hungary, the surviving lords of the Holy Roman Empire breathe a collective sigh of relief. They firmly believe the extreme cold will save them. They believe these invading barbarians will pack up their felt tents and retreat to whatever frozen wasteland they came from. Once again, European arrogance writes a check that European blood is about to pay for. The people of the West fundamentally misunderstand the psychology and the physiology of their enemy. The Mongols do not fear the cold. They were born in it. The Mongolian steppe is a high-altitude, freezing desert where winter temperatures regularly plunge so low that the moisture in your breath turns to ice before it hits the ground. They wear layers of tightly woven silk under thick wolf fur. They know how to open a small vein in their pony's neck, drink a few mouthfuls of hot blood for survival sustenance, and close the wound without harming the animal. They do not need cumbersome supply lines or slow-moving foraging parties. They are an entirely self-contained, mobile ecosystem of violence. For generals like Subutai and Batu Khan, winter is not a time to rest. Winter is hunting season. The cold actually hardens the marshlands that normally slowed their horses down, turning the muddy terrain of Eastern Europe into a high-speed, frozen highway. Despite this terrifying reality, there is still one thing standing between the Mongol vanguard and the glittering wealthy cities of the Holy Roman Empire: the Danube River. It is one of the widest, deepest, and most treacherous waterways in all of Europe. For months, it has acted as a massive, unbreachable moat. Refugees from the slaughter at Mohi have fled across it in small boats, begging for sanctuary in Vienna and beyond, knowing the Mongol ponies cannot swim across its churning, freezing currents in heavy armor. The Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor place all their remaining faith in this geographic shield. As long as the river flows, Western Europe is safe. But nature, it seems, has a deeply morbid sense of humor. As December turns into January of 1242, temperatures plummet to record-breaking lows across the continent. It is one of the coldest winters in recorded medieval history. The mighty Danube begins to slow. Slush forms along the muddy banks, then thickens into jagged sheets of ice. And then the unthinkable happens. The entire river freezes completely solid. The freeze is so deep that the ice groans and cracks like artillery fire under the pale winter moon. The Mongols do not simply rush blindly across, they are ruthlessly calculating. They leave captured livestock untethered on the eastern bank to see if starving European peasants will risk crossing the ice to steal the animals. When the desperate peasants cross safely and return with the stolen meat, Subutai has his answer. The ice can hold the weight. The great moat of Europe has hardened into a bridge thick enough to support the thundering hooves of 100,000 horses. The last natural barrier protecting Western civilization simply ceases to exist. When the news reaches the capitals of Europe, the psychological collapse is absolute. Panic sweeps through the streets of Vienna, leaps across the snowy Alps to Rome, and infects the royal courts of Paris. Chroniclers of the time write that the fear is so suffocating that people are dying of sheer terror before a single arrow is even fired. The Holy Roman Emperor sends frantic, desperate letters to the other monarchs of Europe, begging them to stop their petty civil wars and unite, but it is entirely too late. There is no grand coalition coming to the rescue. There is no army left to field. The Pope is utterly paralyzed, realizing that excommunications and papal bulls mean absolutely nothing to men who worship the eternal blue sky. The kings of Europe suddenly realize that they are completely naked. Merchants bury their gold, priests begin offering last rites to entire cities, and the Mongols are seen calmly walking their horses across the frozen expanse, looking at the undefended lands of Austria with the cold eyes of a butcher sizing up a prime cut of meat. It is the early spring of 1242, and the smell of burning pine and roasting flesh is drifting into the outer suburbs of Vienna. The Mongols have not launched their main assault on the Holy Roman Empire yet, but they want the West to know they are coming. This is the Mongol concept of psychological preparation. Before they dismantle your army, they dismantle your mind. Small, highly mobile groups of light cavalry, the terrifying vanguard scouts, are spotted riding casually through the Austrian countryside just a handful of miles from the capital's walls. They do not attack the heavily fortified cities yet. They just burn the surrounding farms, slaughter the livestock, and let the thick, black smoke block out the sun. They are methodically turning the breadbasket of the empire into a scorched wasteland, ensuring that when the inevitable siege begins, the cities will already be starving. Inside the stone walls of Vienna, the psychological collapse is absolute. The citizens are not preparing for a conventional war. They are preparing for the biblical end of days. And you cannot blame them. The The bleeding refugees pouring in from the east bring stories that completely shatter the fragile European sanity. They whisper about the grand city of Kiev, once a shining jewel of the medieval world, reduced to a field of cracked skulls and blackened timber where the few survivors had to eat their own dead. They talk about vast cities in Russia and Persia that simply ceased to exist, wiped off the map so thoroughly that future generations would forget they were ever there. The people of Europe finally understand that they are not dealing with a rival kingdom. They are dealing with a cosmic reset button. And what is the absolute leadership of Western Europe doing in the face of this literal apocalypse? They are bickering over imaginary lines and archaic titles. Pope Gregory IX and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II are locked in a bitter, egotistical feud over supreme authority. While Subutai is calmly calculating the exact logistical requirements needed to bring down the walls of Western civilization, the two most powerful men in Europe are writing angry letters excommunicating each other. Emperor Frederick sends out a pathetic, desperate plea to the kings of France and England, begging them to stop their petty squabbles and send money, weapons, and men. The King of France largely ignores it. The King of England essentially says it is not his problem, believing the English Channel will magically protect him from an army that just crossed a frozen ocean of a river. The absolute pinnacle of European chivalry is completely paralyzed by its own toxic, narcissistic politics. So, the massive iron gates of the eastern cities are barred shut. The towering stone cathedrals are packed shoulder to shoulder with weeping peasants, terrified merchants, and trembling lords, all praying to a god who seems to have abandoned them to the wolves of the eastern steppe. They know their heavy armor is useless. They know their slow horses are a liability. The horizon glows a violent, angry red every single night. The absolute annihilation of the West is no longer a distant possibility. It is a scheduled event. The hammer is raised, the anvil is set, and the executioner is just taking a deep breath before delivering the fatal blow that will end European history forever. But then, right as the spring mud begins to thaw and the final assault is expected, something entirely inexplicable happens. The executioner simply walks away. While the popes and emperors of the West are busy barricading their oak doors and begging a silent sky for salvation, the actual savior of Europe is already at work. But it is not a legion of angels with flaming swords. It is not a sudden, miraculous spark of European courage. It is a catastrophic biological failure happening 4,000 miles away. The fate of Western civilization does not hinge on the tactical genius of a king or the thickness of a stone wall. It hangs entirely on the rotting, cirrhotic liver of a 55-year-old alcoholic. December 11th, 1241. Deep in the heart of the Eurasian steppe, in the sprawling imperial capital of Karakorum, the supreme Khan of the Mongol Empire is having a drink. Actually, Ogedei Khan, the third son of Genghis and the absolute master of the known world, has been having a drink for several days straight. He is not fighting a glorious duel. He is not expanding his borders. He is lying in a lavish tent, sweating profusely and vomiting blood as his internal organs finally shut down from decades of severe, unrelenting alcohol abuse. He has quite literally drank himself to death. The supreme irony of history is that the war machine that slaughtered millions, the unstoppable force that shattered the armies of Russia, Poland, and Hungary without breaking a sweat, is momentarily paralyzed by a bad hangover. When Ogedei's heart takes its final struggling beat, an invisible political shockwave explodes outward from that tent. According to the rigid, unbending laws of the Yasa, the ancient legal code laid down by Genghis Khan himself, the death of a great Khan means the entire world must hit pause. Every Mongol prince of the blood, no matter where they are, no matter how close they are to completely conquering a continent, must immediately drop their weapons, turn their horses around, and return to the homeland. They have to attend the Kurultai, the Grand Political Council, to elect the next supreme leader. If you don't show up, you forfeit your claim to the empire, or worse, you get executed for treason. But Batu Khan and Subutai do not know this yet. They are sitting on the banks of the frozen Danube, breathing in the cold European air, sharpening their curved blades for the throat of Vienna. They are weeks away from launching the spring offensive that will turn the Holy Roman Empire into a graveyard. Enter the Yam. This is the Mongol imperial postal system, an intricate, continent-spanning network of relay stations spaced exactly 1 day's hard ride apart. It is a biological telegraph wire that makes European communication look pathetic. A lone rider is handed a sealed message and a golden medallion of absolute authority. He wraps himself in thick furs, climbs onto a sturdy pony, and rides west. He has one singular, brutal job: ride until the horse beneath him literally collapses and dies, flash his medallion at the next station, mount a fresh horse, and keep riding. This unnamed messenger is about to cross over 4,000 miles of the most unforgiving, freezing, violent terrain on the planet in the dead of winter. He does not stop to sleep in a warm bed. He binds his torso tightly with cloth so his internal organs don't rupture from the endless bouncing in the saddle. He eats strips of dried meat while galloping. He rides through blinding blizzards, across frozen lakes, and over jagged mountain passes. He is a solitary, freezing missile of political bureaucracy hurtling toward Europe. If this one man breaks his neck in a ditch, if he freezes to death in a storm, if he is eaten by wolves on the Russian steppe, Subutai unleashes hell and Paris burns. The entirety of Western history, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the modern world as we know it, is now riding on the exhausted, frostbitten shoulders of a single rider, galloping desperately against the clock. It is the spring of 1242. The siege engines are built, the horses are rested. Subutai is sitting in his war tent, staring at a meticulously drawn map of the Holy Roman Empire, calculating exactly how many days it will take to burn Vienna to the bedrock. The vanguard is already in place, the trap is perfectly set. And then a solitary rider collapses at the edge of the Mongol encampment. His horse is dead from sheer exhaustion, his face is blackened by severe frostbite, but his hand is tightly clutching the imperial seal of Karakorum. Batu Khan and Subutai unroll the mandate. The Great Khan Ogedei is dead. The alcohol finally claimed him. In an instant, the greatest military offensive in human history hits a concrete wall of absolute, unbreakable bureaucracy. You have to understand the agonizing frustration of this exact moment for the Mongol commanders. They are standing inches from the finish line. Western Europe is utterly defenseless, a glittering vault of gold, unplundered cathedrals, and endless grazing land just waiting to be cracked open. Subutai has spent years orchestrating this continental symphony of death. It is the magnum opus of his brutal career. But the unbending law of the Yasa does not care about military momentum. The ancient code laid down by Genghis Khan mandates that all princes of the royal bloodline must physically return to the Mongolian steppe to participate in the Kurultai, the Grand Council that elects the next supreme leader. Batu Khan is a brilliant warlord, but he is also a paranoid politician. He fiercely hates his cousin Guyuk, who is actively maneuvering for the throne back home. Batu knows the ruthless political reality of his own family. If he stays in Europe to conquer a few more stone cities, Guyuk will seize absolute power, declare Batu a rebel, and send the entire unified Mongol war machine to hunt him down. He cannot risk it He is forced to make the most painful, tactical decision of his life. He must abandon his masterpiece to save his own neck. People studying this era always ask the exact same question: why did the Mongols turn back? For centuries, arrogant European historians tried desperately to invent flattering reasons to stroke their own egos. They claimed the heavy European cavalry finally intimidated the barbarian horde. They claimed the towering stone castles of Austria were simply too tough to crack. They claimed the Pope's frantic prayers created a divine, impenetrable shield over the West. It is all narcissistic, coping fiction. The Mongols did not turn back because they were frightened. They did not turn back because they were beaten. They turned back because of a sudden change in corporate management. What happens next is perhaps the most surreal and anticlimactic moment in all of medieval history. The citizens of Vienna, heavily armed, terrified and starving, are standing on their stone walls waiting for the apocalypse to begin. Priests are giving last rites. Mothers are hiding their children in dark cellars. They expect the horizon to darken with thousands of armor-piercing arrows. They expect the booming thunder of Subutai's gunpowder bombs to shatter their heavy oak gates. But the morning sun rises and the horizon is completely, terrifyingly silent. The smoke from the distant enemy campfires begins to thin out. The air clears. A few desperate European scouts cautiously ride out to the Mongol positions, expecting to be ambushed and slaughtered. Instead, they find nothing but trampled grass, horse dung, and discarded animal bones. An army of over 100,000 men, the most flawlessly efficient and destructive force the world had ever seen, simply packed up its felt tents and vanished like a phantom into the eastern mist. There is no messy, panicked retreat. There is no disorganized fleeing. It is an orderly, mechanical withdrawal. The Mongols take their massive wagons of plunder, their thousands of chained slaves, and their unbroken pride, and they ride back across the blood-soaked plains of Russia. They leave behind a continent of traumatized, trembling survivors staring blankly at the empty fields, completely unaware that Western Europe did not win the war. They survived it purely by a stroke of blind, alcoholic luck. Let us pause the ruthless political theatre in Karakoram for a moment. While the alcohol-induced death of Ogedei Khan is a historical fact, modern science is beginning to rip away the mythological veil of this era to reveal a truth that is much grittier and far less romantic. The history of human civilization is not just dictated by royal decrees or bloody arrow storms. Sometimes the survival of an entire continent is decided by shifting weather patterns and the absolute, unbreakable laws of biology. To understand this, you have to understand the core mechanics of the Mongol war machine. Do not look at them as a standard medieval army. Look at them as a massive biological engine. Subutai's ultimate weapon was never gunpowder or the composite bow. It was speed, and that speed was entirely dependent on one specific piece of hardware, the Mongolian pony. An Eastern cavalryman never rode to war with just one horse. He brought a string of 3 to 5 remounts, rotating them constantly, so his primary vehicle never ran out of stamina. Do the basic biological math. If Batu Khan has roughly 100,000 men sitting in the center of Europe, that means there are over 400,000 horses stomping the ground of the Hungarian plains. 400,000 massive biological engines require an insane amount of daily fuel to keep running, and that fuel is grass. In the winter, these incredibly tough animals can use their hooves to dig through deep snow to find dried forage. That is their survival superpower on the frozen steppe. But as the winter of 1241 gives way to the spring of 1242, a catastrophic climate event suddenly drops right on the Mongols' heads. Modern paleoclimatologists, by analyzing ancient tree rings and ice cores, have discovered a shocking detail. The spring of 1242 was one of the wettest, coldest, and most abnormally damp periods in recorded medieval history. For months, relentless torrential rain hammered the European continent, and that astronomical amount of water turned the vast Hungarian plains, the exact grazing land Subutai had targeted as his staging ground, into an endless, inescapable swamp. The mud rose to the horses' bellies, the fresh spring grass, the vital fuel these animals desperately needed to recover from a brutal winter campaign, was completely submerged under rotting, stagnant water. You cannot graze 400,000 horses in a shallow lake. The magnificent beasts that had carried the fate of Asia on their backs began to rapidly waste away, starving to death by the tens of thousands on the very land they had just conquered. This mud did not just kill the horses, it entirely neutralized Subutai's military doctrine. The lightning-fast mobility vanished. Feigned retreats and complex flanking maneuvers become a literal joke when your horse cannot pull its hooves out of thick, sucking clay. The heavy siege weapons and massive wagons of plunder sank straight into the earth. The ruthless reality of war is this. Subutai might be an unparalleled tactical genius, but he cannot order the sky to stop raining. If the Mongols pushed deeper into the Holy Roman Empire, they would be fighting on foot, starving and stripped of their one true advantage. Ogedei's death provided the perfect political excuse to save face, but it was the physics of mud and rain that physically jammed the gears of the apocalypse. Nature intervened, and the West was saved, not by the bravery of knights, but by a rotting swamp. When the mud of that apocalyptic spring finally dried under the summer sun of 1242, a chilling silence settled over Eastern Europe. The survivors began to timidly crawl out of dark caves, deep forests, and damp cellars. What they saw was not a kingdom waiting to be rebuilt, but a continental graveyard stretching all the way to the horizon. The smell of rotting flesh and charred timber still hung heavy in the air. The Mongols had vanished. The most ruthless meat grinder in human history had turned back toward the east, but their phantom never truly left. They left behind a permanent bleeding scar on the psychological identity of Europe. The brutal truth is that this invasion completely shattered the West's arrogant illusion of supremacy. For centuries, the European elite firmly believed they were the center of the civilized universe, protected by God and armed with the ultimate military doctrine. In a few short, violently bloody months, Subutai delivered a horrifying reality check. Europe was not an impenetrable fortress. It was just a tiny, fragile peninsula attached to the edge of a violent Eurasian landmass, a juicy piece of meat that managed to roll off the chopping block at the very last second. This psychological trauma immediately manifested into physical paranoia. King Bela IV of Hungary, who had been forced to abandon his crown and flee to the coast of the Adriatic Sea just to avoid being executed, returned to his wasteland of a kingdom with national-level PTSD. He learned the hard way that earth and timber forts were absolutely useless against Eastern firepower. Instantly, he triggered the most frantic building program of the Middle Ages. He ordered every noble and landowner to build massive stone castles. He handed out royal land to anyone who could afford to erect towering granite walls. The entire architectural landscape of Eastern Europe changed overnight, not for aesthetics, but out of pure, blind terror. The Pope, a man used to ordering kings. Around and excommunicating emperors, was reduced to sending lowly friars on a desperate, multi-year journey across thousands of miles of hostile wasteland to the Mongol capital. They did not go to dictate terms, they went to beg the Great Khan not to come back and finish the job. The Mongol response was a cold, arrogant letter demanding that the Pope and all the kings of Europe submit personally, or face total annihilation. But the Mongols never did return with that same apocalyptic focus. Their empire fractured under the weight of its own massive civil wars, leaving Europe alone to eventually rise, conquer the globe, and write the history books, casting themselves as the eternal victors. But we know the truth. We know that the foundation of the modern Western world, with all its art, philosophy, and power, once hung by a frayed thread over the abyss of total extinction. History is not always a heroic tale of good triumphing over evil. Sometimes history is a cruel joke. Western civilization was not saved by shining armor or divine intervention. It was saved by a muddy swamp in Hungary and the failing liver of a dying alcoholic 4,000 miles away. If you have made it to the end of this dark journey, you clearly appreciate the gritty, unvarnished truths of our past. If this story of survival shifted your perspective, please hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss our next historical deep dive. And before you go, drop a comment below. What do you think was the real savior of Europe in 1242, the death of the Khan or the catastrophic weather? I read every single comment. Thanks for exploring the shadows of the past with me, and I will see you in the next chapter of Dark History.